The Galactic Union had once been a symbol of hope, a collection of worlds united by peace and progress. But now, it was nothing more than a crumbling relic, slowly being torn apart by the relentless Varkari swarm. These alien creatures, known for their brutal strength and hive mentality, had swept across the galaxy like a tidal wave, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. The Union's once strong fleets, made up of dozens of species with advanced technology, could do nothing but retreat. With every battle, they lost ground, and soon the galaxy's central systems were on the brink of collapse. Commander Alaris stood in the war room, staring at the star charts flickering on the screen. The galaxy was divided into sectors, and almost every single one had fallen to the Varkari. The enemy was like an unstoppable force, a swarm that seemed to know no fear, no mercy. The Union's leaders had been divided, arguing endlessly about what to do next. Some suggested negotiating, others proposed retreating further, but Alaris knew that it was all futile. They were losing. Fast. She had seen the battle reports from the front lines. Entire cities had been wiped out in a matter of hours. The Varkari didn't just conquer, they annihilated. The mood in the war room was heavy, almost suffocating. The constant beeping of alarms and the hushed voices of military strategists only added to the tension. Alaris felt the weight of every decision pressing on her shoulders. She had always been a tactician, a planner. She prided herself on being able to think her way out of any situation. But this was different. There was no clever plan that could save them now. No amount of negotiation or strategy could stop the Varkari from burning their way through the galaxy. Their numbers were overwhelming, their tactics ruthless. For the first time, Alaris felt a sense of true despair. As she ran her fingers over the cold surface of the command console, something caught her eye. It was an old file, buried deep in the archives. It was labeled Human Record, Restricted. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she clicked on it. The humans. The once proud species that had fought their way into the stars, only to fade into history. The treaty that had been signed decades ago had banned all references to humanity's most dangerous asset, a weapon that had been erased from all records. Alaris hesitated for a moment before opening the file. What she found shocked her. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a man. A single human who, decades ago, had fought in a war that had not only decimated an entire species, but had also left a mark on history so dark that no one dared speak of it. The file listed his name, Kane Mercer. Alaris read the information with growing disbelief. Kane Mercer was humanity's darkest legend, a man whose very existence had been hidden from the galaxy. He was not a hero. Not a leader. He was a weapon of such terrifying power that even the highest authorities in the Union had banned all records of him. But the file was clear. Kane Mercer was humanity's last hope. The War Council had kept the file locked away, but in this moment of desperation, Alaris realized they had no other choice. If they were to survive, they needed to bring him back. But there was a problem. Kane Mercer wasn't just a soldier, he was a legend who had been sealed away for a reason. His mind, his methods, they were all part of what made him so dangerous. He wasn't a hero, they had made him something else entirely. And now, faced with extinction, Alaris was about to do the unthinkable, awaken him from his cryosleep and release him into the war. She moved quickly, making the call to the hidden station where Kane had been kept. The coordinates had been locked for years, known only to a few in the highest ranks. But desperation knows no boundaries. Within hours, Alaris and her team were on their way to the moon where Kane's cryochamber lay dormant. As they approached, Alaris couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to unleash something they might never be able to control. But she had no choice. If they didn't act now, the Varkari would wipe out everything they had fought for. The ship touched down on the barren moon. Cold, metallic silence filled the air as they made their way to the facility. The walls of the station were covered in dust, a forgotten relic from a past war. Alaris felt the tension build with every step. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of man Kane Mercer had become or what he might do when released. The door to the chamber opened with a low hiss, revealing the cryopod that contained the human legend. Inside, Kane Mercer lay frozen in time, his face a perfect mask of calm, as if he had never aged a day. Alaris gave the order, and the pod began to thaw, the cold chambers slowly releasing the man who had once been feared across the galaxy. As the last traces of ice melted away, Kane's eyes fluttered open. He stared at the faces of the officers around him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice cold as the void of space, Kane Mercer spoke for the first time in decades. "You're all out of options." His words hung in the air, and for a brief second, Alaris wondered if they had made a mistake. But the truth was undeniable. This was their last chance. They had summoned him. Now, they had to trust that he could deliver the victory they so desperately needed. But as Kane stood, ready to face the Varkari once more, Alaris knew that the galaxy would never be the same again. They had unleashed humanity's darkest legend, and now no one knew what would happen next. Commander Alaris couldn't shake the chilling weight of the decision she had made. The command room had become eerily silent, filled only with the hum of outdated machinery and the occasional beep of alerts. The file she had uncovered, hidden deep within the archives of the Galactic Union, haunted her thoughts. Kane Mercer. The name echoed in her mind like a dark warning. She had read it over and over, each time trying to understand why humanity had hidden such a dangerous figure away, erasing his name from history itself. Kane wasn't just a soldier, a warrior, or a strategist. He was a weapon, forged for a purpose no one dared to speak of. Alaris had seen hundreds of names listed in the Union's records, heroes, diplomats, scientists. But this name stood apart, buried in silence for a reason. His existence was forbidden knowledge, something that humanity's leaders had worked hard to bury. But now, with the Varkari swarm overwhelming the galaxy, Alaris had no choice but to take that forbidden knowledge and act on it. She had released Kane from his cryosleep, an act that would send ripples through the very foundation of the galaxy. The Union's leaders had warned her, reminding her that some things are better left forgotten. But as she stared at the holographic map of their dwindling territory, those warnings seemed far less important. The Varkari were ruthless, their forces unstoppable. The Union's fleets were scattered, their last line of defense crumbling under the weight of the enemy's attacks. Entire star systems had fallen, and it seemed like there was no end in sight. In the face of such destruction, Alaris knew there was no turning back. The human warrior, Kane Mercer, was the only one who had ever stopped the swarm before decades ago, during a brutal campaign that had torn apart an entire species. The records were vague, the details even more so, but one thing was clear: Kane was humanity's darkest legend, a figure so terrifying that even the Varkari had feared him. Alaris still couldn't comprehend how one man, one human, could have held such power. But now, standing before her, was that very man, his eyes cold and calculating, as if he had never left the battlefield. He had woken up with no questions, no curiosity. He had simply asked, "Who am I killing?" The simplicity of the question struck her like a punch to the gut. Kane Mercer was not interested in diplomacy or peace. He was here for one thing and one thing only: war. The chamber was cold, but it wasn't just the temperature. The silence between Alaris and Kane was suffocating, like the calm before a storm. He stood tall, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable. Alaris couldn't decide if he was a man or something else entirely. There was a darkness in him, something beyond human. He had been shaped by a war that no one had ever dared to discuss, a war that had left scars deep in the galaxy's soul. The swarm had been one of humanity's greatest enemies, but Kane had single-handedly brought them to their knees. His methods were unorthodox, brutal, but they had worked. And that was what Alaris needed. A weapon, not a hero. A man who could... Looked at the faces of the council members, she could see the fear behind their brave masks. No one wanted to admit it, but they were all afraid of what would happen once Kane set his sights on the enemy. What if the darkness that had shaped him was too much to control? Kane didn't seem to care about their fears. He didn't care about anything except the mission. In his eyes, Alaris saw the truth. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need their support. He was a force of nature, something they had summoned out of desperation. The rest of the galaxy might have feared him, but Kane Mercer wasn't interested in fear. He was interested in destruction. His only concern was the swarm, and he was willing to do whatever it took to bring them down. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice flat, almost robotic. His tone made it clear that he didn't expect answers, he expected action. Alaris quickly laid out the strategy: strike deep into the heart of the Varkari fleet, hit them where they least expected, and dismantle their leadership. It was a risky plan, one that required precision and timing, but it was the only one left. Kane's eyes never left her as she spoke, his gaze intense, as if he was already analyzing every detail, calculating every move. When she finished, he simply nodded. "Let's begin," he said, turning to leave. No grand speeches, no rallying cries. Just a single sentence that held all the weight of the galaxy in it. Kane Mercer was ready. And so were they. The War Council didn't waste time. Within hours, they had gathered their remaining forces, ready to send Kane into the fray. The mission was set. The ship that would carry him into the heart of enemy territory was already in motion. As Alaris watched him prepare for the assault, she felt a strange sense of foreboding. She didn't know if they had made the right choice. She didn't know if unleashing Kane would save them or doom them all. But she knew one thing for certain: once Kane Mercer entered the battle, there would be no going back. The galaxy's fate rested in his hands, and all they could do was pray that humanity's darkest legend would be enough to turn the tide. As Kane's ship sped toward the Varkari fleet, Alaris sat in her command center, watching the holographic feed of the approaching battle. The plan had already been set in motion, but there was a gnawing feeling in her gut. She had read the records, she knew what Kane had done in the past. But this time was different. The Varkari were unlike any other enemy they had faced, and no one knew if Kane's methods would work again. Would he be the galaxy's savior, or would he become its greatest nightmare? Only time would tell, and Alaris couldn't shake the feeling that, once again, they had played with something they didn't fully understand. The air aboard the command ship was thick with tension. Every officer, every soldier, every pilot. Kane Mercer, humanity's darkest legend, was about to be sent into battle once more. This time, however, there would be no safety nets, no backup plan. If this failed, they were finished. The Varkari swarm, relentless and unstoppable, had taken too much already, and now they were poised to strike the heart of the Galactic Union. The command ship hummed quietly, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts racing through Commander Alaris's mind. She had read the reports, seen the devastation, and yet she still couldn't fully grasp the truth of what they had done. They had awoken a man who once had been humanity's deadliest weapon, now unleashed against a threat far beyond anything they had ever faced. Alaris stood at the bridge, staring out at the stars as the ship traveled deeper into Varkari territory. Kane Mercer stood a few steps behind her, his dark eyes fixed on the holographic map of the enemy's fleet. He had shown little emotion when he was awakened from cryo-sleep, almost as if he were simply returning to a job he'd never truly left. His presence was chilling silent. The crew had been warned of his brutality, his methods, but none of them knew just what to expect. Kane wasn't a soldier. He was something else, something forged in the fires of war. He was a weapon, and he was about to be unleashed into the heart of an enemy that had taken everything from them. "Are we ready?" Alaris asked, her voice steady but betraying a hint of uncertainty. She had worked with countless officers and soldiers, but Kane Mercer was something beyond any of them. She had never been this unsure about a mission before. "Yes," came the cold reply. It was Kane. He didn't need to say more. He didn't need to explain himself. The simplicity of his words cut through the tension like a blade. "We're ready. I'll do what's necessary." Alaris turned, looking at him one last time. She wanted to ask him what he meant, to find out just what he... Unimaginable destruction. In the past, he had decimated entire civilizations without hesitation, his tactics cruel and efficient. There was no mercy in his methods, no concern for collateral damage. Kane Mercer fought to win, no matter the cost. The Varkari wouldn't stand a chance, but at what cost would the galaxy pay for this victory? Without another word, the mission began. Kane Mercer was loaded into his personal drop pod, and the ship prepared to deploy him into the heart of enemy space. Alaris's fingers hovered over the controls. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment they had hoped would turn the tide of the war. She could almost feel the weight of the decision in her chest. There was no turning back now. As Kane's pod ejected from the ship and plunged toward the Varkari fleet, Alaris felt a strange sense of detachment. She watched the pod streak across the stars, a small, insignificant object compared to the vastness of the enemy forces waiting below. The odds were stacked against them, and yet, with Kane Mercer in the fight, there was a sliver of hope. The plan was simple. Kane would infiltrate the heart of the Varkari fleet, take out their leaders, and cripple their command structure. Once the Varkari lost their leaders, their forces would falter, and the Union could strike back. But Alaris couldn't shake the feeling that this simple plan might spiral out of control. Kane was a man driven by a singular purpose: to destroy. There was no room for negotiation, no room for compromise. It was kill or be killed. Kane's pod slammed into the surface of a Varkari warship, tearing through layers of armor like paper. The impact sent shockwaves through the vessel, but Kane didn't pause. He stepped out of the wreckage as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience, his cold eyes scanning the area with ruthless precision. The Varkari, known for their hive-like mentality, didn't seem to realize what had just happened. But Kane Mercer did not give them a chance to react. His weapon was in his hand, a sleek, blood-red blade that hummed with deadly energy. With swift, calculated movements, he began his slaughter. Alaris watched from the command ship as the holographic map flickered, showing Kane's movements as he cut through the Varkari forces with ease. His presence was like a shadow, always one step ahead, always in control. Each strike was lethal, each movement a step closer to the heart of the enemy's command. It was like watching a master at work, beautiful, horrifying, and unstoppable. But even as he tore through the Varkari, Alaris couldn't ignore the gnawing fear that something was changing in Kane. His actions, once swift and calculated, were becoming more violent, more brutal. The longer he fought, the more it seemed like he was losing himself to the war. Kane had always been a weapon, but now he seemed like something far darker. Alaris watched as he ripped through Varkari soldiers, tearing them apart without hesitation. He didn't just kill, he destroyed. The precision of his strikes was gone, replaced by a primal rage that sent shivers down her spine. Was this the Kane Mercer they had awakened? The man who had once been humanity's greatest champion? Or was this the beast that humanity had tried so hard to bury? As Alaris observed his actions, she realized that the line between humanity and monster was far thinner than she had ever imagined. The Varkari forces began to falter, their ranks thinning as Kane tore through their leadership. The swarm was disorganized now, confused. They had lost their direction, and their forces crumbled under the weight of their disarray. Alaris saw the flicker of hope in her officer's eyes. It was working. Kane was making the difference. But even as the Varkari began to retreat, Alaris couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. They had unleashed the forgotten, the dark legend of humanity. And now, there was no telling where this path would lead. Kane Mercer's last act was one of pure destruction. He disabled the Varkari flagship with a single blow, sending shockwaves through their entire fleet. As the ship exploded in a brilliant burst of light, Alaris felt a surge of triumph only to be immediately followed by a sense of dread. The battle was over, but the cost had been far greater than anyone had anticipated. Kane Mercer had won the battle, but at what cost to himself? And more importantly, what would he do next? The war was supposed to be over. Humanity had dealt the final blow to the Varkari swarm, decimating their forces and leaving their fleet in ruin. The Union had won. But for Commander Alaris, the victory felt hollow. In the wake of Kane Mercer's destruction, the galaxy was no longer the same. The cost of bringing the legend back had been far too high. Kane's mission was complete, but the toll it had taken on him was immeasurable. He had fought like a beast unleashed, a force of nature that entirely. The others were gone, the officers and crew members who had once looked to Kane as their salvation, now gone from the room, leaving only her and him. He hadn't spoken since the battle had ended, since the Varkari had fallen. It was as if the very victory that had brought humanity's enemies to their knees had also taken everything from him. The man who had been their weapon was now just a shadow of the monster he had once been. "Cain," Alaris said softly, trying to draw his attention. She had seen this before in soldiers, men and women broken by the horrors of war. But Cain was different. He was never supposed to be broken. He had been humanity's perfect soldier, the ultimate warrior, the one they had called upon when all hope seemed lost. But now, he seemed to have lost all purpose, all drive. His eyes were empty, devoid of the fire that once burned within him. It was as though something inside of him had snapped, and he no longer cared about anything. No longer cared about the battle he had won. He raised his head slowly, his gaze meeting hers with a faint flicker of recognition. But there was no warmth there, no spark of life, only the cold stare of someone who had seen too much, done too much, and now was simply lost. "I did what you asked," Cain said in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. His words were devoid of emotion, devoid of the power that had once echoed in his every syllable. "The swarm is broken. The fleet is shattered. The galaxy is safe." He paused, as if considering his next words carefully. "But I'm not the same. I'm not the man I was." Alaris swallowed hard, her heart heavy with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. She had known what would happen when they revived Cain. She had read the files, heard the stories of his past, how he had been forged in the crucible of endless wars, how his mind had been twisted by the horrors of battle. But she had never truly understood it until now. Cain had been the weapon they needed, but in doing so, they had unleashed something far darker, something that had consumed him. The man they had resurrected was not just a soldier, he was a monster. And now, that monster was staring her in the face, a creature that had lost its humanity in the name of victory. "What happens now?" Alaris asked, her voice thick with the weight of the question. She didn't know if she was asking him or herself. What could they do with a man who had done the impossible, who had saved them all, but in the process had destroyed himself? Cain didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up from the chair, his movements slow and deliberate, as though the weight of his own existence was too much for him to carry. He walked to the window, gazing out at the stars, the same stars that had once represented hope, now a silent reminder of the cost of victory. "I've killed so many," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "So many I can't even remember their faces. So many I didn't care to remember. And now I can't forget. Every life I took, every choice I made. It haunts me. I thought I could control it. I thought I could be the weapon you needed. But I wasn't just fighting the enemy. I was fighting myself." Alaris felt a chill run down her spine. She had known Cain's history, his reputation as a weapon, but she had never truly understood the weight he carried. She had asked for the legend to return, and now she was left with the consequences. Cain had given everything, but in doing so, he had lost himself. She couldn't even imagine the darkness that plagued his mind, the torment he must have felt as he tore through the swarm, each kill taking a piece of his soul with it. "The cost," Cain continued, turning his back to her. "You wanted a hero. You wanted someone who could end this war. But you didn't realize what it would cost to make a legend. I'm not the hero you think I am. I'm just a weapon. And now that the war is over, I don't know what to do with myself." Alaris couldn't find the words to comfort him. There were no words that could undo what had been done. She had asked for a weapon, and she had gotten one, but in the end, weapons were not meant to heal. They were meant to destroy. And now, Cain Mercer was a broken man, a living monument to the sacrifices made in the name of survival. "The galaxy is safe," Cain said once more, this time with a bitter edge to his voice. "But what about me? What about the cost of what I've done?" Alaris didn't have an answer. She couldn't. She had known the risks, had known what would happen if they revived Cain. But the truth was, she had never anticipated the full scope of what it would cost. Victory had come at a price she wasn't sure humanity was ready to pay. In the end, the galaxy had been saved. But at what cost? Cain Mercer had delivered the victory, but he had lost everything that made him human in the process. And now, as he stood there, a broken man amidst the stars he had once fought to protect, Elorus couldn't help but wonder if the price of salvation was too high to bear. The war had ended, and yet silence hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to settle on the planet like a shroud. The battlefields that had once been alive with the sounds of weapons, cries of soldiers, and the deafening roar of machines now stood eerily quiet. Humanity had won. The enemy had been crushed. The skies were no longer filled with the ominous shadows of approaching warships. But there was no celebration, no victory parade. The silence was deafening. Commander Liana Anders stood on the balcony of the command tower, gazing out over the city that had been saved by the sacrifices of so many. The once bustling streets now seemed empty, deserted. The people who had fought, bled, and died for their survival were now gone, leaving behind a quiet world that seemed almost unreal. It was as if the victory they had achieved had taken something from them, something they could never get back. For weeks, they had fought against an enemy that seemed unstoppable, a force that threatened to erase everything humanity had built. The Varkari were relentless, their technology advanced beyond anything humanity had ever seen. They had come from the dark corners of the galaxy, sweeping across systems like a plague. But now, they were no more. The fleets were shattered, their armies decimated. The Union had emerged victorious. But victory came with a cost. Liana had witnessed the horrors of war firsthand. She had seen her comrades fall, their lives snuffed out in an instant. She had commanded her forces to march into the heart of the enemy's strongest defenses, and they had fought with everything they had. But now, with the war over, all she could feel was a deep sense of emptiness. The victory they had won felt hollow, like something that was never meant to be. Her mind wandered back to the final battle. Kane Mercer, the legendary soldier they had revived, had been the key to their success. His strength, his relentless drive, had led them through the darkest days. He had torn through the Varkari ranks with the fury of a storm, never once faltering. He had done the impossible. But now, Kane was a shadow of the man he had once been. After the final blow had been struck, he had disappeared into the dark corners of the military base, avoiding everyone. No one had seen him since that fateful day. Liana shook her head, trying to push the backslash. The door behind her creaked open, and Liana turned to see Lieutenant Miles enter the room. His face was tired, his eyes hollow, but there was a determination in his step that told her he was still holding on, still fighting through the aftermath of everything they had been through. "Commander," Miles said softly, his voice low, "it's time. The council is waiting for you." Liana nodded and followed him out of the room, her footsteps echoing through the long, empty halls. The corridors, once bustling with officers and soldiers, now felt like a ghost ship, empty and abandoned. The war was over, but the scars remained, and no one knew how to heal them. The council chambers were just as empty as the rest of the base. The leaders of the Union were gathered around the table, their faces grave. There were no cheers, no words of triumph. Instead, there was only the quiet weight of responsibility that hung over them all. Commander Anders, Admiral Harrington, greeted her, his voice hoarse. "We've been waiting for you." Liana took her seat at the table, her mind still racing. She could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken words that no one dared to speak aloud. The war was over, but the consequences of their victory had not yet fully settled. There were still many questions to be answered, many decisions to be made. "How do we move forward?" Liana asked, her voice breaking the silence that had lingered for far too long. "The Varkari are gone, but the damage they've caused. The lives lost, the cities destroyed. How do we rebuild?" Admiral Harrington sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the question had become too much for him to bear. "I wish I had an answer, Commander. I wish I could tell you that everything will be fine, that we can just pick up the pieces and move on. But the truth is, we don't know. We don't know how to heal the wounds of this war, how to bring the people back to life." Liana's eyes flickered to the others around the table. Each of them was a leader, a symbol of the Union's strength and unity. But they, too, were broken. They had led their forces to victory, but in doing so, they had sacrificed parts of themselves they could never get back. They were soldiers at heart, not politicians, and the weight of what had happened hung on them all. We can't just forget, Liana continued, her voice stronger now. We can't ignore the pain, the loss. But we also can't let it define us. We have to rebuild. We have to find a way to honor those we've lost, to move forward and make sure their sacrifices weren't in vain. The room was silent for a long moment. No one spoke, as if they were all waiting for something. For a sign, perhaps, that the future was still worth fighting for. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the distant hum of the bass, a reminder of how quiet the galaxy had become after the war. Finally, Admiral Harrington broke the silence. "You're right, Commander. We can't let the silence define us. We will rebuild, not just the cities, but the very soul of humanity. But it will take time." Liana nodded, feeling a flicker of hope stir within her. The battle had been won, but the war for peace had only just begun. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The scars would remain. The memories of what they had lost would never fade. But as long as they held on to the courage to face the future, as long as they remembered those who had fought and fallen, they would rebuild. And so, the silence after victory began to fade, replaced by the quiet determination of those who had survived. The galaxy would heal, in its own time, and humanity would rise again.